All right, welcome back. This is going to be the last part of our notes for Chapter 2 on transplantations in borderlands. So we'll finish that up today. And the quiz, of course, will be on Thursday. And Friday, we'll start on Chapter 3. So the other 2 days, we've talked about kind of the Chesapeake colonies, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. Yesterday, we talked about the New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Today we're going to talk about the other 2 areas that were a little less significant, but still important nonetheless. And these are the Restoration colonies and the Middle colonies. Sometimes people call the Restoration colonies the Southern colonies too. We're talking here about the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, as well as Georgia later on. But Restoration refers to the period after King Charles II is restored in England. Now, I mentioned in Chapter 1, England in the mid-1600s went through a difficult time as their monarchy was removed and overthrown for only the only 10-year period since it was first established in the 11th century. So there's a 10-year period where there's no king, and England is ruled by a Lord Protector, a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell ultimately dies. The English Civil War kind of resumes a little bit, but what they end up essentially doing is just restoring things to the way they were before, and they put in power King Charles II, who is Catholic. So that's why they call this the Restoration, or the Restoration period in England, because the monarchy is restored, Catholicism is restored, and everything is the way it was before again in England. Okay, so the Restoration colonies, we get the restoration of King Charles, and he immediately seeks to establish more colonies in the Americas. King Charles is a believer in the economic power that can be brought through increasing trade with the New World, and thinks that he will make people happier if he, basically the moneyed interests. You've maybe read that term or heard it before, moneyed interests, which is basically just means people with money, and people have money, they have power. So moneyed interests in Britain. Charles wants to make those people happy so they don't, have another rise up against him again and against the monarchy again. So he seeks immediately to establish some more proprietary colonies in Britain or in the New World. The first place he does this are the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. And he basically does kind of what happened with Calvert and the proprietary colony of Maryland, where somebody in the favor of the king, somebody that the king likes, he grants them the opportunity to have a proprietary colony where they pay an annual fee, and basically the king or the monarchy or the government stays out of their hair, and they can do with this colony essentially what they want. So the man that he kind of encourages and gets to establish 2 proprietary colonies in the Americas is a man by the name of Anthony Ashley Cooper. Okay, again, someone who was in the favor of the king. He was an earl, the Earl of Shaftesbury, so basically a pretty prominent figure in England, and he helps establish the Carolinas. He was a well-respected figure in England, and thought it would be a great way to build wealth and money, initially off further establishing the tobacco economy. But in the long run, in the very long run, it proves that cotton is going to be the better cash crop down in the Carolinas. But anyway, so Cooper establishes the Carolinas. They weren't really intended at first to be separate colonies, but kind of the way they set up created a division in terms of the people that lived there. North Carolina tended to be kind of more poor people, backwoods poor people, lots of farmers, um, and there wasn't a ton of slaves in North Carolina early on. These were, look, if you were somebody, who would populate North Carolina? These would be poor people that wanted to start over in the New World. These would be maybe some indentured servants that were already there. This is where the cheap land is, the available land is, so they go to North Carolina. And they actually established a fairly strong tobacco economy in North Carolina. If you've ever heard of Tobacco Road in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, when they're talking about like college basketball and Duke and UNC and that sort of thing. And then South Carolina tended to be much more for wealthy people, much more aristocratic, very aristocratic society. And of course, there were more slaves. Reason for this, okay, the reason for this essentially is that South Carolina was just believed to have better land. It wasn't as hilly. It was a better climate because it was a little further south. And a big part of that was that there was a very good harbor in South Carolina in the city of Charleston. Of course, named after King Charles II. Charleston became one of America's, became one of the colony's greatest cities. Probably its second greatest harbor early on after the harbor, Boston Harbor. So if you're in the year 1700 or thereabouts, and you would say, what are the biggest, greatest cities in the colonies? Your top three would probably be Boston, Philadelphia, or New York, kind of a push between those two, and Charleston. Charleston was a really important city, mostly because all the slaves from Africa that would make their way to America came through Charleston. Here's the Caribbean, and then Africa over here. So basically, the slave ships would go to the Caribbean, they drop off and whatever they wanted down there, and then whatever was left, they'd make their way up to Charleston. So it became this big hub for the slave trade, and because of that, it became a very wealthy and thereby very aristocratic and powerful location and city. Okay. Again, we've talked a little bit about governments and constitutions and things like that the different colonies are establishing. The fundamental constitution for Carolina sets up a very elaborate system in the colony of land distribution and a very strict social order. Okay, helps further to divide between the poor North Carolinians and the wealthier, more aristocratic South Carolinians. So it kind of establishes this difference between the two that would be around for quite some time. One of the big things that we start seeing in these state constitutions is something that would become an important part of the United States later on in determining how land distribution is going to work. When we get to Chapter 6, we'll talk about, when we get to Chapter 5, we'll talk about the Northwest Ordinances and something called the grid system that basically set up a land distribution system as the United States gets larger and larger. And we see remnants of that same grid system still around today. The fundamental constitution for Carolina kind of establishes, at least early on, the basis for what that system would become, as it again is an elaborate system created for land distribution in the Carolinas, but it also then separates the wealthy and the poor, right? So we're already seeing that, the kind of that disunion between the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy get the good stuff, the poor are left with whatever's left over, and that's what they have to deal with. Same thing that we kind of see in society today to a certain degree. Same thing that we saw in Virginia when Bacon's Rebellion, when the poor folks were pushed out further west, and they rebelled against the people in charge. So we kind of talked about the ties with the Caribbean. The Carolinas, particularly South Carolina, have a very close tie with the Caribbean, largely because of the slave trade. The slaves always make their way whatever extra slaves there are, make their way from the Caribbean island areas all the way up here into South Carolina, and that's how that aspect of the slave trade is well established. So there's that really close tie, and that's going to be really, really important in the long run, okay, because of those ties. That's how the system of slavery and the practices that begin to be implemented in American slavery are defined at the beginning, right? Because remember, they come from the Caribbean. The Caribbean, the traders from the Caribbean come up and say, well, this is how we treat the slaves. This is what we do. And Americans start to, pick up on a lot of those similar practices, for better or for worse, mostly for worse. Because remember I said the other day, when that first slave ship arrived, and early on in American slavery, people didn't really know what to do with these Africans that were coming over. It was the relationship with the Caribbean and kind of, I guess for lack of a better term, teaching them what to do with the slaves that showed America, introduced really the system of slavery to America. We talked about this already, kind of the division of Carolina, poor in the north, wealthier in the south, and ultimately that creates two separate colonies or states. All right, so this is the 13 colonies. Georgia, much smaller than it is now. South and North Carolina, you notice their sizes are a little bit different, or shapes are a little bit different. But these are the 13 original colonies. And by this time, 1710-ish, they're all there. So let's go to New York and Pennsylvania, otherwise known as the middle colonies. Obviously, because they're kind of there in the middle. Okay, so remember, New York first started as a kind of a non-English controlled place. It was first controlled by the Dutch, but the English kind of forced their way in there and coaxed the Dutch into letting them take control of New York, and now New York is now a settlement for, is technically a British settlement. But New York actually early on is kind of a strange place. So let's talk about this stuff here, right? So we've got four different types of colonies. You've got middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania. You've got your Chesapeake colonies. I know it says or a Chesapeake colony, but that's kind of a separate group. So you've got the Chesapeake colonies, you've got the middle colonies, you've got the New England colonies, or you've got the southern colonies. Hopefully you notice that each region and each set of colonies have some aspects to them that are uniquely their own. And, where in the New England colonies, they're very, very religious, very, very Puritan. In the middle colonies, you'll find they're a little bit more progressive in their thinking. They're more of a melting pot. There's not as much conflict with Native Americans in New York and Pennsylvania. Then you've got your Chesapeake colonies, where they're kind of the first ones, and they're this mixture of people seeking to make wealth through farming and plantations, as well as, the only colony that has any strong Catholic footing in Maryland. And then the southern colonies, which are very, very different, right? They are very dependent on slavery. The Carolinas, they're dependent on ultimately cash crops, largely tobacco and cotton later on. And they have a very different type of society, very aristocratic, very male-dominated, but in a different sense. These are all things we're going to talk about a little bit more in Chapter 3. So, the funny thing about New York, which of course New York City is our biggest city, and New York is our third largest state in terms of population today, but early on there weren't many people in New York. Basically, there were so many different people in New York that it really didn't identify with one particular group, right? New York had, because there was a good port there, and it was further to the north, there were a lot of French there, French fur traders. There were the Dutch people that hung back. There were a lot of poor folk that had, kind of been around and been there in Americas for a couple generations, didn't really have a place to go. And then you have the British there. So it's kind of right away, England, or I'm sorry, New York could be described as kind of right away a bit of a melting pot. You get a little bit of everybody there. For that reason, it was tough for people to find kind of united society. And people that were coming, most people, especially for the North, people that were coming to the Americas were seeking a united society and a united bunch of ideas. So that disunity that kind of existed in New York at the time was just something that people largely weren't looking for. So ironically enough as it is, because we know how much New York would become, this great state, and so much that happens in America comes from New York, early on it wasn't really the most desirable place to be. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, is a little bit different story. You might recognize this guy. You say, oh, that's the Quaker Road guy. Actually, it is. It's a guy named William Penn, who, of course, Pennsylvania is named after. Pennsylvania is a very progressive and different type of colony. It also is a proprietary colony, but for a different reason. Okay, so William Penn was this guy that was this Quaker religious guy, was fairly wealthy, and he was someone that the crown basically didn't like, but couldn't really say bad things about. So the king convinced, or basically offered, William Penn, just to get him kind of out of England, the opportunity to start a proprietary colony. Remember, typically, this was something that only happened for the people that were in the favor of the king. But they don't really like William Penn. They want him out of their hair. So they say, hey, why don't you and take your Quakers, your religious Quakers, and you guys go start a colony over in the New World. So he takes advantage of that opportunity, and he goes ahead and starts the colony of Pennsylvania. The Quakers as a society are a little bit different. Like I said, they're more forward thinking. We talked about Anne Hutchinson and how she was kind of looked down upon by society because she spoke her mind and stepped outside the expected practices of women at the time. Quakers were much more accepting of women, were more open to women. In fact, Quaker women could be preachers. In Quaker church services, there is no minister. Anybody who feels moved by the Spirit, so to speak, can get up there and give a homily or give a sermon or whatever it might be. So it was a very unstructured system, but it was one that was very attractive to a lot of people that were maybe looking for something different in regards to their faith. Another way that Pennsylvania kind of stood out was their political system. Again, here's another example of a political charter that was established in the colonies that helps in the long run in the creation of our system in the United States. And this was called the Charter of Liberties. The Charter of Liberties created in Pennsylvania a representative assembly where you have one house, kind of like the United States, a representative assembly. And that was a very rare system at the time. So it made for a political system that mirrored a little bit of some democratic ideals. Again, you're taking from different states and different colonies the things that they do that people like, you mix it together, and at the end of the day, we get our United States of America and our Constitution, and Pennsylvania was part of this. One other way that Pennsylvania stood out was their treatment of Native Americans. William Penn was very good to Indians. He treated them well. He was respectful for them. He looked after Native Americans, and the Quaker people of Pennsylvania did as well because they followed his lead, and that made the relationship in Pennsylvania between the natives and the whites coming a much more positive one. It also helped that the Quakers are teetotalers. In other words, Quakers don't drink alcohol. So, that's one less thing of the 5 Ds or whatever, one less thing that natives have to worry about is, problems with alcoholism and such. Okay, so let's really quick go over just a couple of the basics of slavery in the colonies. Here's some sugarcane field up here, and what slavery looked like in Barbados in the Caribbean. So, in the Caribbean, slavery was really harsh, okay? Because of sugar. Everything was dominated by the sugar trade. Sugar was making so much money for the people in the Caribbean. Remember, they tried sugar here in the U.S. or in the colonies, but it just wasn't the right climate for it, so it didn't work out as well. The thing with sugar is it's very hard to cultivate. It's a really tough crop to grow, and basically, but you can make so much money by it. This is where slavery comes from. The problem was all the natives are dying, so they're too sick, so they're not going to do the work. Indentured servants don't want to do the work either because they know how hard it is. So indentured servants can request some other job or responsibility, and they'll go ahead and do that. When it comes to African slaves, they'll be sent over, and they're willing to do the work of working the sugarcane in the fields in the super hot weather of the Caribbean, and they're able to do it. The other benefit is Africans were more rugged and were less susceptible to the diseases brought on by the white men in contact with the white men. They also knew how to work in the environment. They're familiar with it. They knew how to cultivate some of these crops, and you put all that together with their immunity to disease. Suddenly, you have a whole group of people who can do the work, don't have to get paid, and voila, there you have slavery. Why it becomes so necessary and so viable, first in the Caribbean, and then eventually making its way to the colonies. Okay, slaves worked in extremely rough conditions, super hot, long days, being treated as expendable or less than human, obviously. So really, really bad conditions that these slaves were forced to work in. Remember, we get our ideas of slavery from the Caribbean. Slavery was even harsher in the Caribbean than it was here in the American colonies. But they bring their concepts of slavery up, and we put them into practice to a certain degree. The first set of slave laws are known as the Barbados Slave Codes. What they essentially establish, and this is kind of a whole new concept, they establish a legal recourse for slavery, meaning creating a reason for slavery to exist in a legal fashion. Okay? By the slave codes, they make slaves the property of whoever buys them. They make them subhuman, 3/5 compromise, things like that. They're somehow less than what a full person is. Okay? It helps establish the laws for slavery that would exist in the colonies. Okay? They would be a little less harsh in the colonies, but still, because of these Barbados slave codes, Barbados, by the way, is an island in the Caribbean, it helps to establish a system of slavery as we would have it in America. Again, providing a legal recourse for the existence of slavery. All right, finally, the bottom line, right? By the end of the 1600s, the British have firmly established themselves as the dominant power in the Americas. They have a great mercantilist trade system known as the triangular trade that makes them an economic powerhouse, as well as their already well-established political and military strength. The triangular trade is a really important thing. This is something we're going to talk about more in Chapter 3. The triangular trade is a big economic piece that makes the connection between Europe and Africa and kind of the Caribbean islands in South America and North America, right? So the Americas, Europe, Africa, triangular trade, goods traveling around the world, international trade, that sort of thing. Okay, this makes England an economic powerhouse and gives them really control over the Atlantic. Okay, they're already a political power in Europe, and certainly a country of great military strength. So, however, those living in the colonies are slowly but surely establishing an identity of their own apart from British culture. We talked about that with the King Philip's War, establishing a unique American identity that is separate from that of the British. This identity is only going to grow with each successive generation, right? Same thing for us. All of us came from somewhere else, most of us Europe, right? You may have German background or Spanish background or Irish background. But the more generations that you spend in America, the more America first you are, right? Say your grandparents came over from Italy. They probably still speak Italian, right? But you might not speak much Italian. And they may still identify very closely with their homeland of Italy, and why you may love being Italian or you may love being German, you identify more as an American first, right? So, again, this only grows with each successive generation as British wars, social problems, and weak leadership, which is meant to be leadership, really become a major problem for Britain throughout much of the 18th century. I'll give you a few more seconds to finish writing that down. Please let me know if you have any questions. Quiz on Thursday, packet due Thursday. Let me know if you have any questions about how we do this quiz for you. I know you might have some different ways to get it done. Just let me know. We'll make it work. And that's it. So thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon.